Before Steve brings us the message this morning, if you would again join me in standing for this song, It Is Well With My Soul. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. I sing, oh, the bliss of this glorious song. My sin not in part, but the whole is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord, my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll. A trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. Please be seated.
Thank you. I'm going to struggle today. About a minute ago, Sandy looked at me and she says, "Where's your mic?" I'm like, oh no. Went to the office at the normal time I get my mic. I got sidetracked. I did something else. I ended up here, and I looked up, and we're on the second verse, and it is too late. So I am tied right here this morning, and I will work hard to stay right here this morning. We have actually a tremendous crowd, considering we're officially into summer, and between the 50 people that are in Arizona at Kayenta worshiping this morning and the 30 people that are in Batesville at the North Heights Church with that youth rally this morning, with those 80 people, we love them and we miss them, but it's not as obvious as I would have suspected this morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. It did feel a little weird when I walked up here, though, and I didn't have those beautiful voices that I normally hear right behind me as I stand here on this front row this morning. That did feel a little bit weird. You know, several people have noticed that since Sandy's mother moved here, that we now have 2 Joe Sheltons. And I would love to make them both stand, because they can, you don't have to get very far that you could actually mistake one for the other. But I fear if I did that, I might end up injured later on with no real explanation of what had happened. And everybody would wonder, you know, where's Steve? That sort of thing. But I want to acknowledge this morning this Joe over here, Sandy's mom, along with her husband Upton, celebrate 68 years of marriage today. 68 years. I've entitled the lesson this morning, Show Us the Father. It comes from the words of Philip in John chapter 14, verse 8, where he simply utters those words, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough. Some versions say, show us the Father, and it will suffice. It'll be enough for us, Lord, if you just show us the Father. Jesus had just made that grand statement of John chapter 14, verse 6. I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. You know, oftentimes as we read from the Gospels, we just can hardly believe the difficulty that the disciples have of comprehending and seeing who Jesus really is. We realize that we have difficulties, but we then think, we're 2,000 years separated. We're not right there with him. If I had been right there with him, I would have gained a lot more than they did. Probably not, but I guess it's nice to think that we might have. So Philip doesn't believe he has seen the Father, at least to some degree, but Jesus assures him that he has. Jesus claims that he and the Father are one. It's in the front. Thank you, because you notice I've been looking. Now that was cruel. When it rains, yep. On multiple occasions. I need a rope. Jump back with me to John chapter 5. John chapter 5. He's talking about John the immerser, John the baptizer. Verse 37 beginning, or verse 36 rather, he says, "But the testimony that I have is greater than that of John. For the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. And the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. His voice you have never heard, his form you have never seen. And you do not have his word abiding in you, for you do not believe the one whom he sent." That's also the context in which you find the next verse that we are more familiar with. "You search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they who bear witness about me." Move ahead to chapter 8 of John, verse 28. Jesus says there, "And when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then will you know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own authority, but speak just as the Father taught me. And he who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do the things that are pleasing to him." Jesus, on these multiple occasions, keeps saying that I'm doing what he sent me to do. I'm giving you what he gave me to give to you. He and I are one. We're together. I'm doing what he wants me to do. Chapter 10, if you will, verse 37 out of chapter 10. "If I am not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me," he says. "But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me, and I am in the Father." Where we started there in John chapter 14, notice verse 31 out of John chapter 14. As the chapter ends, he says, "But I do as the Father has commanded me, so that the world may know that I love the Father." And then he says, "Rise up, let us go." In the next chapter, chapter 15, verses 23 and 24, he says, "Whoever hates me hates the Father also. If I had not done among them the works that no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have seen and hated both me and the Father." He keeps saying, we're together. We come together. Now here's the point I want you to transition with me to at this point. Jesus did not leave God the Father in the Old Testament. Now you might say, well, of course he didn't. But then if you're thinking that, you've probably been coming to church all your life, which is a good thing. And you think everybody else sees it that way too, but they do not. So many people struggle with God the Father. And we always struggle because we talk about the Godhead, the three in one, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so we say God the Father, although Paul himself didn't hesitate to say God the Son, the Father of Jesus Christ, because he understands that we use the word God both in its singular form, or at least English singular form, to suggest the Father and the whole of the Godhead. And we use them interchangeably, and so that's fine. And so we tend to do that. But it is significant that with Jesus you're getting the Father. Jesus shows us the Father. Too many mistakenly assume that God is to be found in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament, and oftentimes the conclusion is, I prefer Jesus. If that were true, that would be accurate. Because if God is in the Old Testament and Jesus is in the New Testament, then I prefer Jesus too. But that's not what the Scripture teaches. That's not what Jesus says. So it's no wonder that folks prefer Jesus. And unfortunately today, so many people are stumbling at God and thereby rejecting Jesus. But you see, it's not really true that God is in the Old Testament and Jesus is in the New. Because if you want to really get down to it, Jesus is in the Old Testament too. But the truth is more like this. In the Old Testament, God is dealing in the best way possible with a people who are much more primitive than you and I, and much more primitive than those people Jesus dealt with. Just one simple example that's easy to research. Look a little bit, and I'm not going to speak to the realities there because we have young ones among us, and I mean little bitty young ones. But go and look up the Canaanites of ancient times and look at what these people were and how they worshiped their local gods. And then come back and talk about how I can't believe in the God of the Old Testament. We need to understand, and we need to be able to articulate that the God of the Old Testament, as he's often said, is God himself dealing with a much more primitive people that lived in Old Testament times. People struggle to connect to God because they have relegated him to the Old Testament. God has the Old Testament, Jesus has the New. And too many people today overlay our own 2024 cultural sensitivities onto the past that they don't like and conclude, I can't believe in a God who would. And that's a disservice to ourselves, to common sense, to reasonable reasoning, and certainly a disservice to God. One of the most popular preachers of our day, who I'm not going to mention by name, whose mega church is located in metro Atlanta area. He says, and I quote, Peter, James, and Paul elected to unhitch the Christian faith from the Jewish scriptures, and he says, my friends, we must as well. Now, you might think, well, Peter, James, and Paul said the new law has superseded the old law, and that is quite true and quite accurate. Yes, there's a new covenant in Jesus, but the implications are, and words pretty much portray it if you listen for a minute or two, that what's being said is that Peter, James, and Paul rejected the Old Testament as ancient, unreliable, inaccurate, and unworthy of our consideration. And it sounds very close like he's willing to throw the New Testament in, because in the last statement in that section, he talks about 66 books written by superstitious men. What he's wanting to do, and you appreciate at least part of this, he's wanting to say that it is about Jesus. And it is. It is about Jesus. But Jesus is quoted in the New Testament. It is Jesus' covenant that Peter, James, and Paul are offering and articulating and are revealing. Jesus did not reject the Old Testament. Jesus' law superseded the Old Testament, but he didn't reject it, and he didn't say it's worthless, but he put it in its place. And its place is that it has been superseded by a new law. Go back to John 14 with me for just a moment, if you would. Verse 8, Philip says to him, "Show us the Father." And that's enough for us, right? Verse 7, right after he had said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me," he says, "If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." Jesus specifically saying that when you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And if that's not proof enough, if he's not convinced already, then Philip says, "Lord, show us the Father, and it suffices us." And the following verse, verse 9, "Have I been so long a time, and you still do not know me, Philip?" Plainly, he says again, "Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" When was the last time you were trying to explain something to a stubborn young child? Of course, stubborn young children are not your own, of course. They're somebody else's. And you think, how many, and you know, and maybe you're trying to teach them in school or something, and you say, and at least you think, if not, say, "How many times am I going to have to explain this?" That's kind of where Jesus is. How many times am I going to have to say this? How many times am I going to have to show you this? The same John that's recording these words will record these words in 1 John 4, verses 7 and 8. "Beloved, let us love one another. For love is from God. And whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him." Notice the beginning of Hebrews, of the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, verse 1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purifications for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Says he is the radiance of his glory. I don't know if it comes there or not. I've not done the research. But there's a song that's been popular over the last few years, and the song is entitled, "Shine, Jesus, Shine." And many of you, maybe like me, the first time you heard it, it seemed like a little bit of a strange phrase. But yet, that's exactly what Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 is saying. He is the shine of the glory of God. He is the radiance. He is the glow of the glory of God. And the next statement, it says, and the exact imprint of his nature. The word imprint there comes from the idea of metal engravers, or people who would engrave. They would even engrave in clay, let it dry, and then they would use that clay as a stamp. And the thing about a stamp is every time you stamp it, it says the same exact thing, and there's never any changing it. He is the exact imprint. The exact imprint of the nature of God. Hebrews, Peter here, Paul, maybe Barnabas. It actually might have been Barnabas, probably Paul. In the book of Hebrews, as he begins here, is basically saying the same thing Jesus said. He and the Father are one. He is from him, he is like him, he is part of him. They are part of each other in that sense. The Colossian letter will say it in a very unique way. Chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 1, verse 19. Paul simply says, "For in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell." In him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And in a shorter statement, but yet telling even more, it seems, in chapter 2, verse 9. "For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily." Dwells in him, dwells bodily in him. The fullness of God was in him. You know, the truth is, Jesus is hard to deny. Jesus is hard to deny, though very many people still do. But as Romans 1 suggests to us, I think they deny him by suppressing the obvious truth. You know, when we find truths we don't like, we talked about this just a couple of weeks ago. When we find truths we don't like, we tend to push them down. We suppress them. We ignore them. We negate them. We try our best to deny them because we don't like them. They're not comfortable to us. They're not what we want in the moment. C.S. Lewis very accurately says, one of the most cowardly things, he says, that ordinary people do is to shut their eyes to the facts. John Lennox, in an interview with Richard Dawkins, if you know who those two guys are, Richard Dawkins is the guy who wrote The God Delusion. He's the most vocal critic arguing that God does not exist and that God cannot exist. John Lennox is an Oxford professor who is an apologist of Christianity in many places. And Lennox asked Dawkins, he says, "You say in your book that Jesus probably did not really exist. And you suggest," he says, "that many scholars suggest that scholars debate his existence." And Lennox says, "I've read most all of those scholars, those ancient scholars, and none of them really debate his existence." To which Dawkins says, "Well, some of them do," and then he kind of hem-hawed around a minute and he said, "Okay, I'll say it. Jesus did exist." So he finally acknowledges it because he realizes and he admits pretty much that when he said that scholars debate it, that scholars don't really debate it. He just wishes that scholars debated it. So he said that scholars debated it. But the point is, John Lennox just kind of smiles because Richard Dawkins just said that he acknowledges that Jesus was a real person and that he truly lived. And the truth is, that is beyond debate. The only debate is he who he claims to be? And he himself said, not only is he who he claimed to be, but he's showing us the Father as well. When you've seen Jesus, you've seen God. Don't be tempted. We ought not to be tempted to look back at the Old Testament and say, that's God the Father. And in the New Testament, well, here is Jesus. Because Jesus plainly says that when you've seen me, you've seen him. John will later on say, as we read from chapter 4 of his first epistle, that God is love. But then we've also been reminded just earlier in John's Gospel that God so loved the world that he gave his Son. That's who God is. That's who God is. Are there things that we struggle with in the Old Testament? Well, sure there are. Those things are so disconnected from us, and we don't understand the people very well, and we don't understand the way people thought and operated that long ago, and certainly there are things that challenge us. But the God of the Old Testament is the God that sent Jesus. And it is Jesus that we look up to strive to be more like him each and every day. And he has shown us our Father. I don't know about you. I have been tremendously uplifted today. The songs that Chad led us in were songs of worship. I so much appreciate them. The prayer that Jeremy led was beautifully done, acknowledging who God is and who we are. We come to worship, and I hope you, along with me, have worshiped today. And we speak of and we acknowledge and we exalt the God that we serve and Jesus whom he sent. As we offer this invitation, as we stand and sing this song together, there are things that you'd like to lay before your God, before your church family, whatever be your need this morning. If we can help you address that need, if we can go to God on your behalf, let us know that need as we stand and sing together, please.
I've been held by the Savior. I've felt fire from above. I've been down to the river. My life will never be the same. I've been held by the Savior. I felt fire from above. I've been down to the river. My life will never be the same. All my hope is in Jesus. Thank God my yesterday's gone. All my sins are forgiven. I've been washed by the blood. I'm no stranger to prison. I've worn shackles and chains, but I'm freed and forgiven. Praise God, I'll never be the same, because all my hope is in Jesus. Thank God my yesterday's gone. All my sins are forgiven. I've been washed by the blood. All my hope is in Jesus. Thank God my yesterday's gone. All my sins are forgiven. I've been washed by the blood. Yes, I've been washed by the blood. Thank you, Steve.